The wind in Montana Territory had a way of getting under a person's collar and staying there. A dry, persistent chill that promised a winter long enough to test a soul. In the autumn of 1879, that wind swept through the Bitterroot Valley, kicking up dust from the single road that served the town of Ash Hollow. It rattled the windows of the general store and whistled a lonesome tune through the dark pines that stood like sentinels on the surrounding hills. A distant train whistle was the only sound that occasionally broke the quiet, a reminder that a wider world existed somewhere beyond the jagged peaks. Eliza Hart felt the cold deep in her bones as she stepped down from the stagecoach. At 22, her face was framed by hair the color of cured tobacco, and her eyes held a steady, serious light. She clutched the handle of a heavy wooden box, its corners worn smooth from travel. Inside, nested in felt, was a set of kitchen knives her mother had left her, the only inheritance of any real value she possessed. She had a contract in her pocket, a promise of work as a winter cook for a cattleman named Silas Grigg, and with it, the hope of finally finding a place that felt like it might hold. Grigg's ranch was a testament to his ambition, a sprawling affair with freshly painted barns and fences that stretched farther than the eye could see. The main house was a 2-story structure that looked down on the valley with an air of ownership. Silas Grigg himself stood on the porch, a man whose polished boots and fine wool coat seemed out of place against the rugged landscape. He was handsome in a way that set a person's teeth on edge, his smile thin and assessing. He read the contract she presented, though his eyes barely scanned the words. Yes, Miss Hart, the cook." He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "There has been a change in circumstances. The position is no longer available." Eliza stood perfectly still, the wind whipping a loose strand of hair across her face. She had spent her last dollars on the stagecoach fare. "The contract is for the entire winter. Mr. Grigg, signed and sealed." "Contracts can be unsealed," he said smoothly. "It has come to my attention that you are an unmarried woman. I cannot have an unmarried woman living among my men. It creates complications." Eliza knew a flimsy excuse when she heard one. She had worked cattle drives, where the dust and sweat made men forget such delicate sensibilities. She met his gaze, her own unwavering, "I keep a clean kitchen and a respectable bunk. That is all that should concern you." A flicker of something else crossed his face, a predatory interest that made the cold in her bones turn to ice. "Perhaps other arrangements could be made," he suggested, his voice low. "A woman of your attributes need not spend her winter over a hot stove." The meaning was as clear as the winter air. Her hand tightened on her knife box. She had come here to build a life with her labor and her honor, and she would not trade one for the other. "No, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but firm as granite. "I will not be making other arrangements." She turned without another word and walked away, her back straight, her dignity the only coat she wore against the biting wind. She did not look back. She did not have to. She could feel his eyes on her, and she knew this was not the last she would see of Silas Grigg. The road back toward Ash Hollow was long, and the sky was turning a bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Snow began to fall, not the gentle, dusting kind, but sharp, stinging pellets driven by the wind. Eliza pulled her thin shawl tighter, her mind racing. Mrs. Doyle's boarding house was her only option, but her funds were dangerously low. She walked on, her steps measured, focusing only on the next one, then the next. A sound cut through the wind's howl, sharp and desperate. It was a boy's yell, followed by the low, hungry growl of wolves. Eliza's head snapped up. Through the swirling snow, she saw a scene unfolding near the half-frozen banks of Cade Creek. A boy, no older than 14, was backed against a thicket of willows. A pack of 5 timber wolves circled him, their movements fluid and menacing, their yellow eyes glowing in the twilight. The boy held a broken branch, a useless defense against their closing ranks. Without a second thought, Eliza ran. She unlatched her knife box as she moved, pulling out the heaviest tool she owned, a thick iron skillet. She did not have a gun, but she had this. She burst through the snow, shouting and banging the skillet against a rock, the loud clang echoing in the frozen air. The wolves startled, turning their attention to her, their lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. They were gaunt, driven by winter hunger. For a moment, the standoff held, a desperate woman and a terrified boy against the raw, wild edge of survival. Then a single, deafening crack split the air. A rifle shot, fired not at the wolves, but above them. The sound reverberated off the canyon walls, a command that nature itself seemed to heed. The wolves scattered, melting back into the darkening pines as silently as they had appeared. A man on a sturdy bay horse emerged from the trees. He was broad-shouldered, his canvas coat worn at the elbows, his hat pulled low against the snow. He slid from the saddle, his movements economical and sure. He held the rifle loosely, his gaze taking in the boy, Eliza, and the fresh wolf tracks in the snow. "You all right?" Toby the man asked, his voice a low rumble. The boy, Toby Pike, nodded, his face pale. "Yes, Mr. Cade. They had me cornered. This lady, she ran at them with a frying pan." The man, Jonah Cade, turned his eyes to Eliza. They were gray, the color of a winter sky, and held a profound weariness that went far beyond the day's work. He looked at the skillet in her hand, then at her face, smudged with dirt and flushed from the cold. He saw not foolishness, but a fierce, protective courage. "That was a brave thing to do," he said simply, "and a fool thing. Get your things. I will take you both back to my place. The storm is setting in for the night." There was no room for argument in his tone. Eliza retrieved her knife box, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Jonah helped Toby onto the horse, then swung himself up behind the boy. He reached a hand down to Eliza. "Come on." She hesitated for only a second before taking it. His grip was strong and calloused as he pulled her up to sit in front of him. The ride to his ranch was silent, save for the creak of leather and the whistling wind. Cade Creek Ranch was a different world from Griggs' domain. The fences were sturdy but weathered, with one section near the barn showing a hastily patched break. The main house was a simple, one-story log structure, its windows dark. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a lonely plume against the darkening sky. A profound quiet hung over the place, the kind of quiet that comes from loss. Inside, a stone fireplace offered a welcome warmth. The main room was sparse but clean, furnished with a sturdy wooden table, a few chairs, and a worn armchair near the hearth. It was clearly the home of a man living alone, a place stripped down to necessities. Jonah saw to the boy first, checking him for any injuries before sending him off to the small loft to get warm. Then he turned back to Eliza. "Thank you for helping Toby," he said. "He is a good boy, but he sometimes forgets how quickly this land can turn on you." "Anyone would have done the same," Eliza said, though she knew it was not true. She set her satchel and her heavy knife box on the table, as she did. The leather flap of the satchel fell open, revealing its contents. Tucked inside, beside a small book of recipes and a change of clothes, was a folded letter. It was old, the paper yellowed, but the official seal of the United States federal government was still visible, stamped beside a name that would have sent a chill through most folks in this territory. It was the name of her father, a man known not for his honor but for his infamy, a notorious outlaw shot down during a train robbery years ago. This letter was the last piece of him she owned, a secret she guarded more fiercely than her knives. It was the reason she insisted on contracts, the reason she walked away from Silas Griggs' indecent proposal without a backward glance. She was building a life brick by brick, a life that would stand on its own, far from the shadow of that name. She did not know if this quiet, lonely rancher had seen it, but its presence in the room felt as loud as the howling wind outside, a constant reminder of the past she was running from. and the unforgiving world that would judge her for it if it ever came to light. The hoarfrost was already gathering on the window panes, a beautiful and chilling pattern, a stark reflection of the cold prejudice she knew was always waiting just outside any warm room. The morning brought a world blanketed in white, the storm having passed, leaving behind a profound and echoing silence. Jonah was up before the sun, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to his own company. He found Eliza awake, sitting by the hearth where the embers still glowed. She had her knife box open on the table, the steel implements clean and ready. She looked up as he entered, her expression composed. Though he could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the question of her future hung in the air between them. He poured 2 cups of coffee, the smell of it rich and dark in the cold room. He handed one to her. Her fingers brushed his, and he felt the chill still on her skin. He spoke directly, wasting no words. He needed a cook for the winter. His last one had quit 2 weeks prior, heading for warmer prospects in California. The work was hard, the days long. She would have the small room off the kitchen for her own. He would pay her a fair wage at the end of each month. And, he added, his gray eyes meeting hers with a seriousness that left no room for misunderstanding, there was to be no talk. He ran a quiet ranch and aimed to keep it that way. Eliza listened, her gaze steady. She thought of Silas Griggs' polished boots and veiled suggestions. She looked at Jonah Cade's worn coat and the simple, stark offer of honest work. There was no choice at all. She accepted. She told him she was a hard worker and would earn her keep. Her word was her bond. And so, a new rhythm began at Cade Creek Ranch. Eliza claimed the kitchen as her own territory. A small but functional space she quickly transformed. She found Jonah's supplies to be basic and disorganized. Sacks of flour and beans stood against one wall. A side of bacon hung from a hook, and a few tins of preserved peaches gathered dust on a shelf. Within a day, she had taken a full inventory. She scrubbed the cast-iron pots until they shone. She organized the pantry, her neat, looping script on small paper labels identifying salt, sugar, and spices. The smell of baking bread soon filled the small house, a warm, life-affirming scent that had been absent for too long. She taught Toby how to properly knead dough, his clumsy hands slowly learning the push and fold. She showed him how to make cornbread in a skillet, the crust perfectly crisp. In the afternoons, when the main chores were done, she would clear the kitchen table, sprinkle a fine layer of flour across the wood, and with her finger, trace the letters of the alphabet. Toby, who had never had any formal schooling, watched with wide-eyed fascination. He learned his letters from a cook who smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, his first classroom a kitchen table. The days settled into a routine. Jonah and Toby would be out with the cattle from dawn until dusk, their face chapped by the wind. They would return, cold and weary, to the warmth of the house and a hot meal waiting for them. Eliza's stews were thick with salted beef and root vegetables. Her biscuits were light and flaky, for the first time in years. Jonah Cade ate not just for sustenance, but with something approaching enjoyment. Their conversations were sparse, built around the necessities of the day. He would tell her if a fence needed mending near the north pasture, and she would tell him if the flour sack was running low. Yet, in the quiet spaces, a cautious understanding began to grow. He noticed the way she never wasted a scrap of food, turning stale bread into pudding and potato peels into a broth. She noticed the way he always left his muddy boots on the porch, a small act of respect for the clean floors she kept. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a deep, abiding decency. She was direct and principled, her straightforwardness a welcome change from the deceptions of the world. When Jonah brought the ranch ledgers to the table one evening, he hesitated. It had been his wife's task, keeping track of the expenses in her elegant handwriting. He opened the book, and the sight of her script was a familiar ache in his chest. But the ranch had to survive. He picked up the pen and, in his own rough, blocky letters, began to make an entry for the salt he had purchased in town. It was a small step, but it felt like letting a little air into a sealed room. Across the table, Eliza was doing something similar. In a small, leather-bound journal, she carefully wrote down the recipe for the beef stew she had made that night, adding a note about using a bit of coffee to deepen the flavor. She worked under the soft glow of the kerosene lamp, her expression focused. One day, she thought to herself, a quiet but fierce ambition taking root in her heart. One day I will have a place of my own, an eatery, a place where any traveler could find a hot meal and a moment of peace. But the quiet world they were building could not remain isolated for long. Ash Hollow was a small town, and secrets were a currency it did not trade in. When Jonah went to the general store for supplies, the whispers followed him down the aisle. A young, unmarried woman living out at the Cade place. It was not proper. The women of the church sewing circle discussed it over their needles, their voices low and sharp with judgment. The talk inevitably reached the ears of Sheriff Mark Tilson. He rode out to the ranch one afternoon, his horse a fine black gelding that looked too well fed for a public servant's salary. He was a large man who filled out his uniform, his face perpetually flushed. He claimed he was there to check Jonah's hunting permit. He tipped his hat to Eliza as she stood on the porch, his eyes lingering on her with an insolent familiarity. He asked her if she was settling in all right. His tone was slick with insinuation, implying that her duties might extend beyond the kitchen. Jonah stepped out of the barn, his face calm, but his eyes were as hard as river stones. He showed the sheriff the permit. He answered the questions about the deer population without a hint of agitation. He stood between Tilson and Eliza, a quiet, immovable barrier. When the sheriff made another pointed remark about the living arrangements, Jonah simply said that Miss Hart was his cook, and a good one, and that was the end of the matter. Defeated by Jonah's unshakable calm, Tilson finally mounted his horse. As he rode off, Jonah and Eliza both saw a figure on the ridge overlooking the ranch. It was a man on horseback, sitting perfectly still, watching them. Even from that distance, they recognized the posture of Silas Grigg. He was surveying the land, his land, or what he believed would soon be his. The first big snowstorm of the season arrived a week later. It came without warning, a furious blizzard that descended from the mountains and swallowed the valley in a blinding wall of white. The wind howled like a hungry animal, rattling the log house to its foundations and driving snow into every tiny crevice. Jonah and Toby had been caught out checking on a herd in the upper meadow. Eliza was alone. She stoked the fire, her ears straining against the roar of the wind for the sound of their return. As darkness fell, a new sound joined the storm's chorus, the terrified bawling of calves. She grabbed a lantern and fought her way to the small calf shed. The wind had torn a section of the roof loose, and one of the walls had splintered, leaving a wide gap. Snow was whipping inside, and the 5 newborn calves huddled together, their small bodies already trembling violently with cold. They would not survive the night like this. Panic tried to grip her, but she forced it down. Her mother had taught her that survival was about using what you had. Her eyes scanned the shed, the barn, the house. She saw the bucket of beef tallow she had rendered the day before. She saw the small charcoal stove used for heating branding irons. An idea, desperate but practical, took shape. She worked with a feverish intensity. She dragged a heavy wooden workbench against the broken wall to block the worst of the wind. Then, using her bare hands, she scooped up handfuls of the thick, greasy tallow and began packing it into the cracks of the door and the splintered wall. The cold was so intense it burned her skin, her fingers quickly growing numb. But she did not stop. The tallow hardened almost instantly, creating a crude but effective seal against the wind. Next, she carefully lit the small charcoal stove, positioning it in the center of the shed, far from any hay. The air slowly began to lose its razor edge. She found old grain sacks in the barn and rubbed the half-frozen calves until their circulation returned, their bawling quieting to soft murmurs. It was nearly midnight when Jonah and Toby finally staggered back to the house. half frozen and exhausted. Jonah's first thought was for the livestock. When he saw the light in the calf shed, his heart sank, fearing the worst. He found Eliza inside, her face pale with exhaustion, her hands raw and red. But the 5 calves were alive, huddled near the gentle warmth of the stove. He looked at the wall, packed with tallow. He looked at the improvised shelter she had created. He looked at her. In that moment, his respect for her deepened into something more profound. She was not just a cook, she was a survivor. She had faced the ferocity of a Montana winter and had not bent. Later, back in the warmth of the house, he cleaned and bandaged the split, bleeding skin on her hands. She winced but did not complain. He found his carbine, the short-barreled rifle he kept for close encounters. The next day, when the sun was out and the world was a glittering expanse of white, he took her to a clearing and taught her how to shoot. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger. Her first shot was wide, but her second was closer. She was a quick study, her hands steady, her resolve firm. She would not be helpless again. Labor and self-respect were her armor, but she was learning that in this land. A little gunpowder helped too. The fragile peace at Cade Creek did not last. One morning, Jonah and Toby rode out to check the west pasture and found the fence cut clean through. The wire had been snipped with heavy shears, not broken by weather or a spooked animal. Beyond the gap, a dozen head of cattle bearing Silas Grigg's distinctive G brand were contentedly grazing among Jonah's herd. A cold knot formed in Jonah's stomach. It was an old trick, one of the oldest and dirtiest in the cattleman's playbook. He sent Toby back to the house to tell Eliza what had happened and to stay there. Then he spent the rest of the morning painstakingly separating the herds, driving Grigg's cattle back through the gap and beginning the long, cold work of mending the fence. Every twist of the wire was a twist of anger in his gut. This was not about a few stray cows. This was a deliberate provocation, a chess move on a board where he was already at a disadvantage. He was not surprised when Sheriff Tilson rode up 2 days later. The sheriff did not come alone. 2 of Grigg's ranch hands were with him, their expressions smug. Tilson dismounted and produced a piece of paper with a flourish. He said Silas Grigg had filed a complaint, cattle theft. He said a dozen of his prize heifers had been found on Cade's land. Jonah stood his ground on the porch, his face a mask of calm. He explained that he had found his fence cut and Grigg's cattle on his property. He had returned them. The sheriff smiled, a greasy, unpleasant expression. He said that was a convenient story. He then produced another document, this one yellowed with age. It was a promissory note, a debt for a wagon load of winter feed from the drought year of 1876, a debt Jonah owed to Silas Grigg. Tilson let the implication hang in the air. A man in debt might be a desperate man might be a thief. He would be conducting a formal investigation. He said he would be back. After they had gone, a heavy silence fell over the ranch. Jonah stared out at the snow-covered fields, but he was not seeing them. He was seeing a different winter. 3 years prior, the winter of the fever. The doctor had called it scarlet fever, a plague that swept through the valley and paid no mind to fences or fortune. It had taken his wife, Mary, and then his little girl, Sarah. He remembered the feeling of utter helplessness, of being the strong one, the survivor, who could do nothing but watch the 2 people who were his entire world slip away. He had survived, but for a long time, he had felt like the most useless man on earth. That debt to Grigg was from that same winter, when in his grief he had let the ranch nearly fall to ruin, when he had bought feed on credit just to keep the last of his herd from starving. The debt was not just paper and ink. It was a monument to his failure. Inside the house, Eliza could feel the tension radiating from him. She knew trouble was brewing, a storm more dangerous than any blizzard. The sheriff's visit had stirred her own ghosts. She found herself touching the old letter in her satchel, the paper soft and fragile. Her father's name was a brand on her soul. She remembered her mother, a woman worn down by a hard life, her hands always smelling of flour and onions. Her mother had worked in a dozen different trail camps and ranch kitchens, always moving, always trying to outrun the shadow of her husband's reputation. Just before she died, she had taken Eliza's hand. "Let the fire in your stove speak for you," she had whispered. "Let your work be your name." Eliza had held on to those words like a prayer. She feared the judgment of good people, the way they would look at her if they knew she was the daughter of a man who had lived and died by the gun. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, the town of Ash Hollow prepared for its annual winter festival. It was meant to be a day of community, a brief respite from the harsh realities of the season. Reverend Abel Crow rang the church bell that morning, its lonely, hopeful peal echoing across the frozen valley. Normally, Jonah avoided such gatherings, but this year felt different. He looked at Toby's eager face and at Eliza, who had been carefully setting aside her best flour and apples for a week. He found he did not want them to go alone. Eliza decided to enter the pie baking contest. It felt like a small act of defiance, a way of stating her presence in this valley not as a rumor but as a person with skill and pride. She baked 2 perfect apple pies, the crust a flaky golden brown, the scent of cinnamon and cooked apples filling their small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. The festival was held in the town square. Bonfires blazed, casting a cheerful glow on the bundled-up townspeople. Hugh Olson, the blacksmith, was serving hot cider, and Dr. May Chen was overseeing a children's sledding race. For a few hours, the town felt like a community. Jonah watched as Eliza, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the excitement, presented her pies to the judges. He felt a stirring of something he had thought long dead inside him, a protective warmth that went beyond his duty as her employer. The whispers started when Eliza's name was announced as the winner. A murmur went through the crowd, a mix of surprise and disapproval. It was Constance Miller, a woman whose husband owed a great deal of money to Silas Grigg, who gave the whispers a voice. She was a tall, severe woman who considered herself the guardian of the town's morality. She approached Eliza as she was accepting the blue ribbon, her smile as sharp as a shard of ice. "What a wonderful pie," she said, her voice carrying so that everyone nearby could hear. "One wonders where you learned such a domestic art. It certainly does not run in the family." Eliza froze, the ribbon in her hand. Constance leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, but still loud enough for effect. "I heard your father was more skilled with a pistol than a rolling pin. They say a thief's blood never thins." The words struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. The color drained from her face. All her fears, all the whispers she had spent her life trying to escape, were suddenly laid bare in the middle of the town square. The people around them grew quiet, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Before Eliza could find her voice, before the shame could completely overwhelm her, Jonah stepped forward. He moved to stand beside her, not touching her, but his presence was a solid, unyielding wall. He looked not at Eliza, but at Constance Miller and the watching crowd. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the cold air with absolute authority. He said, "I do not know about her blood, but I know this, in her kitchen, everyone gets fed." The simplicity of the statement was its power. He was not defending her past. He was testifying to her present. He was speaking of her work, her character, the tangible good she created every single day. He judged her by the warmth of her stove, not the shadow of her father. A different kind of murmur went through the crowd. A few people nodded. Reverend Crow, who had overheard the exchange, gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval. The accusation, which had seemed so potent a moment before, suddenly looked mean and small. Constance Miller, flustered by the direct and unexpected defense, retreated into the crowd. Jonah took the pie from Eliza's numb fingers. He said, "Let us go home." As they walked back toward the wagon, the smoke from their own chimney was visible in the distance, a thin, straight line rising stubbornly against the wind. It was a small beacon in the vast, cold landscape, a sign of the defiant hope they were building together, a hope that was about to be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. The sky had been a strange, bruised yellow all afternoon, a warning the old-timers knew to heed. The wind dropped to an unsettling whisper before returning with a vengeance, a physical blow that slammed against the ranch house. This was no ordinary storm. It was a blizzard, a white monster roaring down from the highest peaks, intent on scouring the world clean. It erased the landscape, blending earth and sky into a single, churning vortex of snow. Jonah stood on the porch, his hand braced against a support beam, the wind tearing at his coat. He could barely see the barn, a faint, dark shape through the maelstrom. His greatest fear was for the small herd he had moved to the line shack in the upper canyon 2 days before, where the winter grass was supposedly more sheltered. That shelter would be a death trap now. He came back inside, the door groaning shut behind him, bringing a blast of frigid air into the relative warmth of the cabin. Eliza and Toby looked at him, their faces etched with worry. "I have to go," he said, his voice low but clear over the scream of the wind. "I have to try and bring them down. They will drift with the storm and be lost." "It is suicide to ride out in this," Eliza said, her voice sharp with alarm. "You cannot see 10 feet in front of you." "They are my responsibility," Jonah replied, his expression grim and unyielding. There was no arguing with the set of his jaw. He was a man bound by duty, to his land and to the animals that depended on him. He gave Toby his instructions. "Keep the fires hot. Do not let the embers die, not for a minute. Check on the calves every hour." He turned to Eliza. "The storeroom will get cold fast. Anything that can freeze. Bring it in here by the hearth." He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers. He did not say, "Be safe." He did not have to. The words were there, unspoken, a heavy weight in the churning air. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around the lower half of his face, and took his rifle and a length of rope. Then he was gone, swallowed by the white fury before he had even reached the barn. The hours that followed were a blur of desperate, grueling work. The wind found every crack and flaw in the log cabin, its mournful howl a constant companion. Eliza and Toby hauled firewood from the porch, their arms aching, their faces raw from the cold. Just as Jonah had predicted, the small pantry off the kitchen became an ice box. They worked together, moving sacks of potatoes and onions, jars of preserves, and slabs of bacon into the main room, piling them near the stone fireplace. The cabin, already small, became cramped with the essentials of survival. Darkness fell, but the storm did not relent. If anything, its fury intensified. With every hour that passed, the knot of fear in Eliza's stomach tightened. She kept looking toward the door, praying to see it open, to see Jonah's broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the storm. But the door remained shut. Toby, his face pale, went out for his hourly check on the calf shed. He came back moments later, his eyes wide with terror. "Wolves," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw them, just at the edge of the light from the barn. They are waiting." Eliza's blood ran cold. The wolves, driven by the storm and a desperate hunger, would be bold. The calves were a vulnerable, easy meal. With Jonah gone, she was their only defense. She thought of the carbine he had taught her to use, but in this blinding wind, a single shot was a fool's hope. She needed fire. She grabbed the pitch pine torch they kept by the door for lighting the barn lanterns. She took a deep breath, the cold air searing her lungs, and plunged a piece of kindling into the heart of the fireplace. When it was blazing, she lit the torch. The resin-soaked wood sputtered and caught, casting a wild, dancing light around the room. She looked at Toby. "Stay here. Keep the door barred until I get back." The moment she stepped outside, the wind hit her like a fist, nearly extinguishing the flame. She cupped her hand around it, her body bent low against the gale. The snow was a solid, moving wall. She could feel the ice crystals forming on her eyelashes. Every step was a battle. The ground was treacherous, a layer of slick ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. She heard the cattle first, their low, terrified moans cutting through the wind. Then she saw the shapes, dark and sleek, circling the calf shed. There were 4 of them. Their eyes gleamed in the torchlight, pairs of yellow-green embers burning in the swirling darkness. Eliza raised the torch high and screamed. A raw, primal sound torn from her throat. The flame billowed and streamed in the wind. She charged forward, slipping on the ice, her boots finding no purchase. The wolves backed away from the light and the noise, but they did not flee. They were testing her, gauging her resolve. One of them, a large male with a graying muzzle, broke from the pack and loped toward her, its head low, a growl rumbling in its chest. Eliza stood her ground, her knuckles white where she gripped the torch, her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic drumbeat against the symphony of the storm. The wind whipped the flame, sending a shower of sparks toward the wolf. It yelped and jumped back. She advanced again, step by treacherous step, pushing them back from the shed, thrusting the torch forward like a sword. It was a terrifying, elemental dance on the edge of survival. The scent of hot pitch and wet animal fur filled the air. Finally, after an eternity, the pack seemed to decide the risk was not worth the reward. They turned and vanished into the white chaos as silently as they had come. Eliza stood there for a long moment, shaking, the torch held in her trembling hand. The immediate danger was gone, but the larger one remained. Jonah was still out there. She was making her way back to the house when she saw him. He was not riding. He was walking, leading his exhausted horse, a dark, lumbering shape barely visible in the blizzard. He stumbled as he reached the porch, falling against the door. Eliza and Toby helped him inside. He was covered in ice, his beard and eyebrows white with it. He was moving with a bone-deep weariness that frightened her more than the wolves had. As they pulled off his frozen coat, she saw the blood. A long, ugly gash ran across his cheek and down his neck, the dark red a shocking slash against his pale skin. "Barbed wire," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "A fence I did not see." He had brought the cattle down. They were safe in the main barn, but the effort had cost him nearly everything. Eliza sat him down in the chair by the fire. She sent Toby for the medical kit, her movements calm and purposeful now. She gently washed the wound with warm water, her touch surprisingly delicate. The cut was deep. It would need stitching. She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a clean cloth, the sharp smell cutting through the air. "This will sting," she said softly. He just nodded, his eyes closed, his face a grim mask of pain. He did not make a sound as she cleaned the gash, the alcohol biting into the raw flesh. She threaded a needle with steady hands, the same hands that kneaded dough and chopped vegetables, and began to close the wound. She worked by the flickering firelight, her stitches small and neat, in the intense, quiet focus of the task. The storm outside seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, the hiss of the fire, and the soft pull of thread through skin. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound. The house was quiet now, save for the ceaseless howl of the wind. Toby had fallen asleep in a corner, wrapped in a blanket. The cattle were safe. The wolves were gone. They had survived the night. A fragile warmth filled the small cabin, a pocket of safety carved out of the heart of the storm. Eliza felt a tremor run through her, a delayed reaction to the fear and the cold. She looked around the cramped room, at the supplies piled by the hearth, at the sleeping boy, at the wounded man who had entrusted them with his home. Her own small room off the kitchen felt a world away. She stood by the fire, wrapping her arms around herself, uncertain of what to do next. Propriety dictated she should retire, but the thought of leaving this small circle of warmth was unbearable. She turned to Jonah. He was watching her, his gray eyes shadowed with exhaustion but clear and focused. The question came out as a whisper, a breath of sound almost lost in the wind's roar. It was a question of practicality, of decency. but it held the weight of everything else that had passed between them. "Should I stay the night?" the virgin cook asked. Jonah Cade, a man who had wrapped himself in solitude for 3 long years, looked at the woman who had faced down wolves for his cattle and stitched his own skin back together. He nodded once. It was a slow, deliberate movement, an answer that contained no hesitation, no doubt, in that single, silent gesture. He chose her. He chose this. He rose slowly and pulled the spare mattress from the loft, laying it on the floor near the hearth, a respectable distance from his own chair. He did not say a word, but his actions were a promise of protection, of shared space without demand. Eliza lay down, pulling a blanket over herself. The warmth of the fire was a comfort to her chilled bones. Jonah sat in his chair, watching the flames. After a moment, he reached out his hand. She met it with her own. His grip was firm, a silent acknowledgement of the vow they had just made, their fingers intertwined, a small point of contact in the vast, howling darkness. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice a low rumble, "we will fix the fence, together." The week following the blizzard was one of quiet mending. Jonah, his face healing beneath Eliza's neat stitches, worked with a renewed purpose. Together, as he had promised, they repaired the fences damaged by the storm. The simple, shared labor of stretching wire and setting posts forged a bond stronger than any spoken words. They moved in a comfortable rhythm, a man and a woman rebuilding a life against the vast, unforgiving landscape. The warmth that had been kindled in the heart of the storm now lived in the daily patterns of their lives. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, and the smell of fresh bread and hot coffee was a constant, welcome presence. The illusion of peace was shattered on a cold, clear morning. Sheriff Tilson rode into the yard, and this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by 2 deputies and Silas Grigg, who sat on his fine horse with an air of triumphant satisfaction. Tilson dismounted and unrolled a warrant. The charge was cattle rustling. "It is a lie," Jonah said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stood on the porch, placing himself between the lawmen and the door where Eliza and Toby watched, their faces pale. "Grigg is missing 15 head of prime beef," Tilson said, his voice loud and official. "And we found them, mixed right in with your herd down by the creek. Funny thing, though, they had your brand. The Cade Creek Sea burned right over Grigg's gi. A sloppy job, a desperate one." Jonah's eyes narrowed. It was a frame, as blatant as it was vicious. Anyone who knew cattle knew you could not brand over another brand without leaving an obvious, ugly scar. It was the mark of a fool or a thief caught in the act. "I have a warrant to search the premises," Tilson declared, pushing past Jonah. He and his deputies ransacked the barn and the outbuildings with a kind of malicious glee. They overturned hay bales and kicked open storage chests. It did not take them long to find what they were looking for. Tucked beneath a pile of old burlap sacks in the back of the tack room was a branding iron. It was not one of Jonah's. The design was a crude, misshapen C, hastily forged and coated with fresh soot. "Jonah Cade, you are under arrest," Tilson announced, holding up the branding iron as if it were a trophy. He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. Eliza felt a wave of cold dread wash over her, colder than any winter storm. Toby let out a small, choked cry. Jonah turned his head and looked at Eliza. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes conveyed a silent, urgent message. Trust, faith. Do not give up. Then the deputies shoved him forward, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the still morning air. They put him on a horse and led him away. A prisoner on his own land. Silas Grigg remained for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, over Eliza, his expression one of cold ownership. Then he too turned and rode off, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any they had known. The ranch felt hollow without Jonah. The hearth, the heart of their small home, seemed to give off less warmth. The fire Eliza dutifully tended burned, but the cheerful crackle was gone. It was a sullen, lonely flame. For the first day, she and Toby moved like ghosts, the shock of the arrest rendering them speechless. But Eliza Hart was not a woman to surrender to despair. Her mother had taught her that work was a cure for sorrow, and that a clear head was the sharpest weapon in any fight. On the second morning, she woke with a new resolve. She found Toby sitting by the cold ashes of the fire, his face tear-streaked. She put a hand on his shoulder. "We are not going to let them win," she said, her voice firm. "Mr. Cade is a good man. We know it. Now we have to prove it." Her words gave the boy a spark of hope. She set him to his chores. Then she went to Jonah's small desk and opened the thick, leather-bound ranch ledger. Inside, in Jonah's rough hand and his late wife's finer script, was a meticulous record of every calf born at Cade Creek for the past 10 years. She spent the entire day poring over the book, comparing the birth records with the number and age of the cattle currently on the ranch. She made careful notes, her own neat handwriting a stark contrast to the grim task. The next day, she rode into town. The journey felt different alone. The wooden bridge that crossed the frozen creek groaned under her horse's hooves. A lonely sound in the vast white landscape. It felt like she was crossing into enemy territory, leaving the small sanctuary of the ranch behind to face a world that had already judged them. Her first stop was the blacksmith's shop. Hugh Olson was a big, quiet man with soot permanently etched into the lines of his hands. Eliza described the branding iron the sheriff had found. Hugh listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. He shook his head. "No one around here uses an iron like that," he said. "And the way you describe the burn marks, layered and ugly. That is not how you rebrand an animal if you know what you are doing. It is how you ruin a hide. It is how you make a spectacle." He agreed to testify to that if it came to it. Her next stop was the church. Reverend Abel Crow was in his study, a small, book-lined room that smelled of old paper and beeswax. Eliza told him everything, her words measured and honest. She did not ask him to provide a false alibi. She asked him to speak to Jonah's character. And, she added, she asked if he would be willing to tell a court where Jonah Cade was, and what he was doing, during the great blizzard. The Reverend looked at her, his gaze kind but searching. He remembered Jonah's defense of her at the festival. He had seen the quiet decency of the man. "I will," he said without hesitation. "A man fighting for his life in a storm is not out stealing cattle. It is my duty to speak the truth." Eliza felt a small measure of relief, but she knew it was not enough. They had planted evidence. They had the power of the law on their side. She needed something more. She needed to find their lie and drag it into the light. That evening, she gave Toby his mission. She knew it was dangerous, and she hated asking it of him. But he was small and quick, and no one would pay him any mind. She told him to be a shadow. She wanted him to follow one of Griggs' ranch hands, a man named Jed, who was known for his loose tongue and his cruelty. "Find out where they are keeping their own cattle," she told him. "Watch them. Be careful, and come back before you are seen." Toby, eager to help the man who had been like a father to him, agreed at once. He was a boy who knew the land, who could move through the trees as silently as a fox. He found Jed at the town saloon and followed him at a distance when he rode out, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The trail led him to a forgotten line shack in a box canyon miles from Griggs' main ranch. There, hidden from view, was a small, crudely built corral. Inside were 24 head of cattle, and Toby saw them doing it. Jed and another man were heating a branding iron, the same clumsy C design, and burning the mark onto the hides of the cattle, right over Griggs' gi. They were creating the very evidence they were using to condemn Jonah. Toby sketched a map of the location on a scrap of paper and found a piece of twine they had dropped, tied with a knot he recognized as unique to the Grigg ranch. While Eliza fought for him on the outside, Jonah fought his own battle on the inside. The jail cell was small and cold, the silence broken only by the whistling of the wind. In the darkness, the old ghosts returned. He saw Mary's face, pale with fever, He saw Sarah, her small hand in his. The crushing weight of his failure during that terrible winter descended on him again. He had been helpless then, and he was helpless now. His pride, the stubborn self-reliance that had been his shield for so long, was a useless defense against iron bars and a corrupt sheriff. All he could do was sit and wait. All he could do was place his life, his land, his future, in the hands of the woman who had come to him out of a snowstorm. He had to trust her. The thought was both terrifying and a source of a strange, unfamiliar hope. That night, back at the ranch, Eliza sat alone in the quiet house. The evidence was piling up: her notes from the ledger, Hugh Olson's expert opinion, Reverend Crow's promise, Toby's map. But she knew it might not be enough against a man like Silas Grigg. She took out her father's letter, the paper worn soft at the creases. The truth of her bloodline was her deepest secret, a vulnerability she had guarded her entire life. But what if it could also be a weapon? What if, by owning the story, by telling it herself, she could rob it of its power to shame her? The thought was terrifying. Grigg's lawyers would surely twist it, paint her as the untrustworthy daughter of a notorious criminal. But hiding it felt like a cowardice she could no longer afford. She folded the letter and put it back in her satchel. She would keep it in reserve, a final, desperate play in a game where she could not afford to lose. The fire in the hearth burned low, but it had not gone out. It was a steady, waiting flame, and she was its keeper now. The makeshift district courtroom, held in the Ash Hollow Town Hall, was packed. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and simmering tension. Men from a dozen ranches stood along the walls, their face grim and curious. The women of the town sat in tight, whispering rows on the hard wooden benches. Silas Grigg sat at a table near the front, flanked by a slick, well-dressed lawyer he had brought in from Helena. They exuded an aura of confidence, of a conclusion already decided. Jonah was brought in and seated beside Eliza. He looked pale and tired, but when his eyes met hers, she saw the steady flame of trust still burning. She gave him a small, reassuring nod, though her own heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was not a lawyer. She was a cook, but she knew the truth was on her side, and she would serve it up as plainly and honestly as a slice of fresh bread. The circuit judge, a weary man named Harrison, called the hearing to order. Grigg's lawyer spoke first. He was a master of words, painting a picture of a desperate, indebted rancher turning to crime. He presented the improperly branded cattle as irrefutable proof. He held up the planted branding iron for all to see. The story was simple, believable, and damning. The crowd murmured, their suspicion shifting toward Jonah. Then it was Eliza's turn. She stood up, her hands clutching the ranch ledger. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her, dissecting her. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice quieter than the lawyer's, but clear and steady. She did not use fancy words. She spoke of seasons and cycles, of the life of a ranch. She unrolled a large sheet of butcher paper on which she had drawn a detailed map of the Cade Creek pastures. She pointed to where each group of cattle was supposed to be, according to Jonah's careful rotation schedule. Then, she opened the ledger. "This book," she said, her finger tracing a line of neat script, "holds the life of every animal on our land. Here is the entry for a calf born on the 10th of October, a heifer. And here, the record of her first winter. Jonah Cade knows his herd not just by their brand, but by their history. He would no sooner steal another man's cow than he would forget the name of his own child." She then addressed the branding iron. She called Hugh Olson to the front. The blacksmith carried a small, portable forge and a square of thick, dry cowhide. With the judge's permission, he heated Jonah's seize iron and the fake one. He pressed Jonah's iron to the leather. The mark was clean, deep, and clear. Then he heated the crude iron found in the barn and pressed it to another spot. The result was a messy, scorched blotch. "That is a ruination brand," Hugh said, his deep voice filling the room. "It is not made to mark ownership. It is made to spoil a hide, to make a mess. It is the work of a man who does not respect the animal or the trade. Then Eliza called for Toby. The boy walked to the front, his face scrubbed clean, his gaze serious. He handed the judge the map he had drawn and the small piece of twine. He told them, in his own simple words, what he had seen in the hidden canyon. He described the men heating the clumsy iron, the pained cries of the cattle, the smell of burned hair. Griggs' lawyer laughed, a short, sharp sound of ridicule, the testimony of a boy, a tall tale to protect his master. The crowd stirred again, the tide of their opinion uncertain. Eliza knew this was the moment. The facts were on her side, but facts could be twisted. She had to give them a truth that could not be denied. She turned to face the judge, but her words were for everyone in the room. "There is one more thing you should know," she said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. "You should know who I am." A deep hush fell over the courtroom. "My name is Eliza Hart. Some of you have heard rumors about my family. Constance Miller was kind enough to share them at the Winter Festival. The rumors are true. My father was a man who lived outside the law. His name was known across this territory, and not for good deeds. He was a train robber, and he died in a shootout with federal marshals." A collective gasp went through the room. She could feel Jonah's eyes on her, a look of stunned surprise. She did not dare to look back at him. She had to finish. She stood up straighter, her chin high. "I have lived my entire life with that shadow, but I am here to tell you that the blood in my veins does not decide what my hands do. My hands knead dough and tend fires. They stitch a man's skin and calm a frightened calf. My honor is not something I inherited. It is something I have built, every single day, with my own 2 hands." The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, she had seized control of the story, stripping it of its power to shame her. She had laid her greatest vulnerability bare and transformed it into a statement of undeniable strength. Then, a chair scraped against the floor. Reverend Abel Crow stood up. "I do not know the woman's father," he said, his voice resonating with moral authority. "But I know this woman. I have seen her kindness and her courage. Her character is her own, forged in the fire of this hard land. And I believe her." Before the murmur could start again, another voice joined in. Dr. Mei Chen rose from her seat. "I am not a character witness," the doctor said, her voice crisp and precise. "I am a physician. I treated Jonah Cade's wound after the Great Blizzard. The injury was severe, consistent with a deep cut from barbed wire, sustained no more than 12 hours before I saw it. It is my medical opinion that a man in his condition, suffering from exhaustion and exposure, would have been physically incapable of orchestrating a cattle-rustling operation on the very same night." The foundation of Griggs' case crumbled. The lawyer, for the first time, looked flustered. Eliza pressed her advantage. She turned, her eyes locking with Silas Griggs. "If your cattle were stolen and rebranded," she said, her voice ringing with challenge, "then the hides would be ruined. A man like you, Mr. Grigg, a man who values profit above all else, would not simply destroy valuable hides. You would store them. I challenge you to allow a search of your main storehouse." Griggs' face went pale. He stood up, sputtering about trespassing and private property, but it was too late. The mood of the crowd had turned completely. They smelled a lie. They clamored for the truth. Judge Harrison, seeing the will of the people, banged his gavel. He authorized an immediate search and deputized a dozen men from the courtroom, including Hugh Olson, to accompany the sheriff. The procession to the Grigg ranch was a strange, silent parade. Grigg and his lawyer rode at the front with Sheriff Tilson, their shoulders slumped in defeat. Jonah, his cuffs now removed, rode beside Eliza. He did not speak, but he reached over and briefly squeezed her hand. It was all the thanks she needed. The storehouse was a large, windowless building behind the main house. The deputies broke the lock. Inside, the proof was undeniable. In a back corner, covered by a tarp, were the branding clamps and irons Toby had described, and in a separate pen, they found 3 calves, the ugly, festering brands on their hides still raw and new. Sheriff Tilson began to sweat, wiping his brow with a trembling hand. He backed away, stammering about a misunderstanding. As he did, he fumbled inside his coat pocket, and a thick roll of banknotes, held together with a paper band from the Helena Bank, fell to the floor. The bribe was as plain as the brands on the calves. It was then that Silas Grigg, his empire of lies collapsing around him, broke. His face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He pulled a pistol from his coat, its dark metal gleaming in the dim light. But before he could aim, a rope snaked through the air. It settled perfectly around Grigg's shoulders, pinning his arms to his sides. Jonah, standing calmly in the doorway, held the other end of the lariat. He gave it a sharp tug. Grigg stumbled forward, losing his balance and crashing to the ground. The pistol skittered across the dirt floor. Jonah did not draw a weapon. He did not need to. He had used the tool of his trade, a rope meant for controlling powerful, unruly beasts. He walked over, retrieved the pistol, and used Grigg's own handcuffs to bind his wrists. The fight was over. Justice had come to Ash Hollow, not with a blaze of gunfire, but with the quiet strength of the truth, the steady hands of a blacksmith, the courage of a boy, and the unshakable honor of a woman who refused to be defined by her past. The community, which had been so quick to whisper and judge, had, in the end, been the instrument of its own correction. The air in Ash Hollow changed after the hearing. The harsh wind of judgment was replaced by a gentler breeze of remorse. The town had been manipulated, its fears and prejudices stoked by a wealthy bully, and the people were ashamed. The apology came not in a formal declaration, but in a series of small, sincere gestures. Mrs. Doyle from the boarding house brought by a jar of her finest peach preserves. Hugh Olson delivered a set of perfectly balanced kitchen knives he had forged himself, a craftsman's apology that needed no words. The most public act of contrition came from Reverend Crow. During his Sunday sermon, he spoke not of sin and damnation, but of the danger of a closed heart and the grace of a second chance. He announced that the church fund, long dormant, would be used to erect a small bell tower at the crossroads just outside of town. It would be a landmark, he said, a beacon to guide travelers. But more than that, it would be a promise. Its bell would ring to call the community together, a sound to remind them to look out for one another, especially for those who had been lost or cast out. The project became the town's penance. Men who had stood by and watched Jonah be arrested now showed up with tools and lumber. Jonah himself was there from the first day, his silence not one of anger, but of quiet dignity. He set the main support posts, his movement strong and sure, his skill undeniable. And on the day the frame was raised, Eliza and Toby arrived in the wagon, its bed loaded with 2 enormous cast-iron pots. She had cooked a rich beef and barley soup, and she served it to every man who worked, ladling it into tin cups. There, in the shadow of the rising bell tower, she fed the very people who had once whispered about her. It was an act of forgiveness so simple and profound that it healed more wounds than any sermon could. The quiet rhythm of life returned to Cade Creek, but it was a new rhythm, one of deeper harmony. The house no longer felt like a lonely man's shelter, but a home. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and lavender, Jonah and Eliza sat together on the porch. He had been quiet all day, a thoughtful, faraway look in his eyes. He turned to her, the new scar on his cheek, a faint silver line in the twilight. "I have not spoken of them," he said, his voice low. "Not to anyone, Mary and Sarah." Eliza did not speak. She simply waited, giving him the space and the silence he needed. Mary, she loved this time of day. He continued, his gaze on the horizon. She would say the mountains were blushing. She was a schoolteacher from back east. She saw poetry in everything. He smiled, a sad, gentle expression. I just saw rocks. He paused, the memories washing over him. Sarah was only 5 when the fever came. She had her mother's laugh. It sounded like little bells. After they were gone, the silence in this house was so loud it felt like I was drowning. For a long time, I thought surviving was a punishment. I thought I did not deserve any more happiness. He looked at Eliza then, his gray eyes full of a truth that was both painful and liberating. Being with you, he said, it does not make the missing them hurt any less, but it makes the silence quiet again. It makes me feel like I am allowed to build something new, right alongside the old foundation. Eliza reached out and took his calloused hand in hers. She had no words of comfort for a grief so deep, but she had her presence, her steadfastness. She had her love, a quiet, sturdy thing that did not seek to erase his scars, but to honor them. His past was a part of him, the man she had come to love, and her own past, the one she had so feared, was a part of her. Here, together, those pasts could finally be at peace. Eliza found her own peace in action. She painted a simple wooden sign, the letters neat and clear, Heart and Cade Kitchen, Fine Provisions. She nailed it to a post at the end of their lane. She began small, selling loaves of bread and jars of apple butter to the few travelers who passed by. Soon, word of the rancher's cook spread. Stagecoach drivers began making a regular stop, their passengers eager for a hot cup of coffee and a slice of her now famous apple pie. She was no longer just a cook hiding in a lonely man's kitchen. She was a proprietor, a business owner, a woman whose name, both Hart and Cade, was a mark of quality and resilience. She had taken the thing she feared most, her own identity, and made it the cornerstone of her future. They were married on the first day of spring, as the last of the snow was melting and the first green shoots were pushing their way through the damp earth. The ceremony was as simple and honest as they were. It was held in the meadow behind the house, with the Bitterroot Mountains as their cathedral. Reverend Crow officiated. Toby, his hair slicked down with water, stood beside Jonah as his best man. Jonah wore a clean shirt and an old, dark necktie that had belonged to his father. Eliza wore a simple blue dress and, over it, a crisp white apron she had embroidered with small blue flowers along the hem. It was the uniform of her trade, the symbol of her honor, and she wore it with more pride than any silk gown. Toby, clutching a small piece of paper, read a blessing he had written himself, his young voice clear and earnest in the quiet air. He spoke of kindness and courage, of hot meals and mended fences. When he finished, everyone clapped. Jonah turned to Eliza, and with a simple "I do," they sealed the promise that had been made months before with a single nod in the heart of a blizzard. There was no lavish reception. Their friends and neighbors gathered in the yard, drinking strong black coffee and eating slices of Eliza's pie. Hugh Olson was there, and Dr. May Chen, and Mrs. Doyle. Even a few of the ranchers who had been uncertain about Jonah just a few months before came to shake his hand and wish his new bride well. The sound of laughter, genuine and warm, drifted across the fields. It was the sound of a community and a family made whole again. Life settled into a new, busy routine. The calving season arrived, and they worked from dawn until dusk, their days filled with the earthy realities of birth and new life. Orders for the Hart and Cade Kitchen grew, and soon Eliza found herself needing to make deliveries to homesteads on the other side of the valley. She was a capable rider for short distances, but long journeys over rough terrain were another matter. Jonah took it upon himself to teach her. He taught her how to sit a horse for hours without tiring, how to read the trail, how to ford a river swollen with spring melt. In those long rides together, with the vast sky above them and the endless land stretching out before them, their partnership deepened. They were more than husband and wife. They were partners, in work, in life, in the quiet, steady business of building a future, one day at a time. The spring thaw came on fast and furious, turning the valley's creeks and rivers into churning brown torrents. The snowpack on the high peaks, which had been a source of so much hardship during the winter, now melted into a new kind of threat. Cade Creek swelled its banks, and the wooden bridge that connected the ranches to the town groaned under the relentless assault of the water, its timbers creaking in protest. The final test for Ash Hollow came not from a man, but from nature itself. A warm rain began to fall, accelerating the melt. The river rose with alarming speed, flooding the low-lying fields and threatening the general store, where most of the town's winter provisions were kept. Panic, which had once been the town's default response to crisis, was quickly replaced by a sense of determined resolve, as if to mark the final end of the old era. A plume of dark smoke rose into the rainy sky from the direction of the old Grigg Ranch. A rider brought the news that the main house and barns were on fire. No one was surprised. It was a cowardly act of arson, the last of Grigg's loyal men destroying whatever records and evidence remained before scattering to the four winds. The townspeople watched the smoke for a moment, a grim acknowledgement of the chapter that was now truly closed. And then they turned their attention to the immediate danger, the rising water. It was Jonah who organized the rescue. He arrived in town with his wagon, his presence a calm, steadying force amidst the growing chaos. He directed the men, his voice never rising, but carrying with an authority born of competence and respect. They formed a human chain, moving sacks of flour, barrels of salted pork, and crates of tinned goods from the store's flooded cellar to the high, dry ground of the churchyard. While Jonah led the men, Eliza led the women. She arrived with Toby, their wagon loaded not with supplies to be saved, but with supplies to be given. She set up a makeshift kitchen on the church porch, protected from the rain. With the help of Mrs. Doyle and several other women, she built a roaring fire in a large, borrowed cauldron and began to cook. Soon, the rich, hearty smell of her famous stew filled the air, a scent of warmth and sustenance that cut through the damp chill of the day. She served it in tin mugs to the exhausted, mud-spattered workers, offering not just food, but a tangible symbol of their shared effort. In the middle of the frantic work, a new sound echoed across the valley. It was the clear, resonant tone of the new bell in the tower at the crossroads. Reverend Crow was pulling the rope, not in alarm, but in a slow, steady rhythm. It was a call to unity, a sound that said, "We are all here. We are all in this together." The bell, which had been built as an apology, now served as the town's heartbeat. They worked through the day and into the night. They saved the town's food supply. They lost the bridge. It was finally torn from its foundations and swept away in the churning water. But they had faced the crisis as a community, standing shoulder to shoulder in the rain and the mud. They had been tested by a man's greed and by nature's fury, and they had not broken. In the days that followed, as the floodwaters receded and the sun returned to warm the damp earth, a new sense of quiet pride settled over Ash Hollow. They had learned a hard lesson. Honor was not a birthright, and it could not be bought. It was something earned, something cooked slow over a long fire of hardship, seasoned with courage and integrity. It was a shared meal that nourished the entire community. One evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the valley, Jonah and Eliza sat on their porch. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and new leaves. The newly rebuilt fences of Cade Creek stood strong and straight. In the distance, the bell tower caught the last golden light of the day. Jonah had spent the last week building them a new porch bench. It was a beautiful piece of work, made of smooth, sanded pine, but it was peculiar in its design. One side of the bench was set 2 inches lower than the other. Eliza had watched him build it, a curious smile on her face. Now, as they sat together, the purpose of his design was clear. With him sitting on the lower side and her on the higher one, their shoulders were perfectly level. He looked at her, a quiet laugh in his eyes. "Equal partners," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The smoke from her kitchen chimney rose behind them, a straight, unwavering line into the calm evening sky. "I have been thinking," she said. "The kitchen is doing well, but travelers need more than just a slice of pie. They need a place to rest, a proper inn, a place with a warm bed and a clean table, a place for anyone who is lost or just weary of the road," Jonah added, understanding her completely. He saw the vision in her eyes, a place of welcome and refuge. "We could build it right here, where the new road will cross the creek." Toby, who had been quietly finishing his chores by the barn, came over to the porch. He stood before them, twisting his hat in his hands, his expression a mixture of adolescent awkwardness and profound seriousness. "I was wondering," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Now that things are settling, I was wondering if I could be your apprentice, for the ranch and for the inn. I want to learn it all. I want to build a life here, with you." Jonah and Eliza looked at each other, and then at the boy who had become their son in all but name. A wide, genuine smile broke across Jonah's face. He reached out and put a hand on Toby's shoulder. "We were wondering when you would ask," he said. The sound of their shared laughter rang out across the meadow, warm and full of promise. In the town of Ash Hollow, folks no longer told the story of the lonely rancher who took in a virgin cook. They told the story of a woman who cooked with her whole heart, and of the man who chose her with his entire life. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment below and let us know where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.